Hello, hi, hello, hi. I feel like this is says more about like podcasting and doing 360 episodes of anything than it does about Aaron. But Aaron kept saying we've been doing the show for 5 years, and we've actually been doing it for 7 years. And I feel like at some point, there's no difference between 5 years and 7 years. It's all just like we've just been doing this forever. It's what we're doing. So I'm going to talk about interviewing today. Hey, let's do this. All right, great. I'm going to talk about interviewing, and in particular, I'm going to talk about some interviews that I have done, and for the journalists in the audience who have gone back and listened to themselves interview people, you know that that choice that I made to talk about my own interviews was dubious because I had to go back and listen to all of these interviews that I've done to prepare for this. And it was like a particularly excruciating form of torture. So now I'm going to share that torture with you guys. A little bit about me before we get there. Oh, it's right here. Great. So Pineapple. We started it 3 years ago, 3 and change. It's now a team of 25 producers. We've made lots and lots of shows. They have been downloaded many, many times. We make all kinds of different shows, including sort of big, sweeping narratives, heavily produced podcasts that take a year or more to make. We do those more often than not with incredible journalists, and they're very heavily produced. There's whole teams going out doing tons of reporting. They've been an incredible experience for me to just be a part of, honestly, and they've also been hits. So we've had 9 shows that have hit #1 on the Apple Podcast chart since we started the company. So that's one part of what we do. But then another part of what we do is interview shows. And when we do those, people tend to sort of lean on me a little bit to help them do it. Oftentimes it's hosts who have never done it before, and they come to me because I've done so many 360 whatever of the Longform podcast. And so first I want to talk a little bit about the things that I have sort of come to realize about interviewing that I can help coach these people with, some of those sort of lessons. Because one thing that's interesting when you go from interviewing to having to coach other people and produce other people in interviews is you have to find some language to describe how it works. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and then I'm going to talk about a sort of surprising thing that I've learned about my own interviews. Before that, I was talking to Evan, our third co-host, who you're going to hear from tomorrow, last night, and I was talking through this presentation, which I was very much still finishing. And Evan told me at the top to not self-deprecate too much. I have a slight tendency to do so. And so, Evan, this part is for you. Just so you know, the point of this is that I've interviewed a lot of people, famous people. Here's Cheryl Strayed, David Gran. This is actually Evan interviewing Ta-Nehisi Coates. I left this in here because this is from the section that Aaron was talking about when the audio was so terrible that we probably shouldn't have put it out. This one is a big interview. It was before Ta-Nehisi was really Ta-Nehisi. But we went to his house and I did the recording and I fucked it up. So I just want you guys to know that happens. Here's me making Renata Adler do a weird face after an interview. Here's Tavi Gevinson on a stage. Very unflattering photo of myself and Terry Gross. Just get that off the screen as soon as I can. Here's my kid. I interviewed him once. And there's Hillary, who I've interviewed a bunch of times. So I have done a lot of these. And here are the things that I tell people who are doing interviews for Pineapple. This one's pretty self-explanatory, but it's actually the thing that matters the most. My experience has been that podcasting is a very unforgiving medium to bullshit. You really can't fake it. If you don't care, if you're not genuinely curious about the person you're talking to, people can hear it. And, as Aaron was talking about, there's 900,000 podcasts in the Apple Store or something like that. And one of the ways that we think about it is most podcast listeners, even the most dedicated podcast listeners, can basically hear 4 or 5 shows a week. It's a habit-based medium. People listen to the same stuff. And so one of the things we think about is like, well, how are you going to knock off one of those 4 to 5 for some number of people? And the answer, at least where it starts, particularly with an interview show, is the host has to be genuinely curious about the person they're talking to. You can hear it. You can hear it immediately if they don't care. Hold on, let me get some water. And so that's one thing that we really focus on. Hold on. We've actually tried to fake it before. We've had like ideas for shows and then gone out and picked a host, and they're bad. They're not good. So we try not to do that, but really, when we think about who people should talk to, then, and we do this with Longform too, the only real rule is you have to genuinely want to talk to them. You should also be prepared, but there's a very specific way I think one should prepare for an interview, which is not to come up with like a crazy list of questions that you go sit down in front of someone and read verbatim. I did that for a long time when we started doing Longform. I would go in with like crazy notes and a list of 50 questions. And what happens is you're staring at your questions while the person is talking. And so, someone's like, and that's when I realized I never loved my father. And then you're like, and then you went to graduate school. And it's a bad scene. It's a bad scene. Nobody wants that. So just so you guys know how we do it now, I walk in with basically like an index card. And I try and think about acts for the interview. So I know like in the first third, I want to talk about where they grew up. Second third, some sort of book they wrote or an article or whatever. And the last third, maybe it's whatever I perceive their great anxieties to be. But I want to know where I'm going, but basically have no roadmap other than that. And what it forces you to do is really listen and be present and ask follow-ups. It's a little bit of like, it's a little bit of a high wire act because you can get down some pretty weird cul-de-sacs if you don't know exactly where you're going. But I found that it's much, much more effective than walking in with a whole arc of questions, because the answer is like, no matter how much you prepare, the person is going to surprise you in some way. And if you have totally figured out who they are before they walk in, you're basically just going to project that on them and sort of force them to respond to it. Another thing I like to do, this is a small thing, but I actually think it's like not that small, is I say the same thing to people every time before an interview. And I stole it a little bit from Terry Gross. But Terry Gross says this brilliant thing at the beginning of her interviews. She says, if I ask you something that's too personal, just tell me it's too personal and I'll move on. And it's really brilliant for 2 reasons. One is that it makes it clear, like, this isn't a gotcha interview. I'm not bringing you here to get you to say something you don't want to say. But it also says, I'm going to ask you some really personal questions. You should get ready. That's coming. And so I ask a version of that, which is basically, if I ask you something dumb or like that doesn't make sense, or basically just that you don't have an answer to, instead of just talking for like 10 minutes and trying to come up with some answer for it, just say, that was one of the dumb questions that you're talking about before, and we'll move on. What I found is particularly men of a certain age will just take questions as a challenge no matter what. So like even if they don't have anything to say, they'll just talk for 10 minutes. And it's terrible. We're going to edit it out immediately. And so I try and just let people know, just tell me it's a bad question. The other thing that I think we learned doing Longform was how important it was to be willing to sound like an idiot. And that's hard. Like the thing that Aaron's saying is true. Like it really is about the guest. It's not about you. Your job is to get the best out of them. And a lot of times, the best way to do that is to ask a simple question that's straightforward. There's this overwhelming urge when you're doing interviews to do like 6 rounds of context before you get to the question so everyone knows how smart you are. No one cares how smart you are. They care how smart the other person is. And so it's awkward. It's uncomfortable. It's like even though it is about the other person, you want to do well. You want people to like you, and you have to get used to and comfortable with like playing the role of the moron, or at least like trying to play the role of the moron. You got to get comfortable with that. But the biggest thing that we've learned, I think, is that you just got to listen. And the best interviews are ones where you're present, where you're there, where you're not looking at your notes, where you're listening to what people are saying. And that's hard. That's like actually a skill that you need to develop. It's not something you can turn on and off, but it actually, that and caring, if you can basically just combine giving a shit and listening, the interview will be good. It's harder said than done, because when you're sitting in there, you're trying to think about what your next question is going to be. It's anxious and it's nerve-wracking. It's kind of a weird situation. You're like sitting alone in a room with someone. And so it's hard. It's hard to be present and to really listen. But that is the key to achieving your goal, which is to get people to think out loud. And really, like, whether I'm producing it or whether I'm doing the interview myself, that's my goal. I just want people to be able to think out loud, to get off whatever their talking points are. But more than that, and again, this kind of connects to what Aaron was saying, you want people to discover something as they're talking to you. And if you care and listen and keep like pulling the thread of whatever they're putting out there, you can get them to stop. And, when I started, when there was like dead space, when there was silence, it was pretty uncomfortable. And like I would often be like, so then what happened? Or how are you feeling right now? And try and fill it. And if you can get out of that space, what happens is people are forced to slow down and fill it themselves. And kind of incredible things can happen, but it can also be pretty uncomfortable. And we're going to get to the discomfort portion of it right now, because as I thought about like, all right, what do I want to say about interviewing? The other thing I'm trying to do, in addition to getting people to think out loud, is to have moments, to create moments that stick with people, stick with me, stick with the guest, but mostly stick with audiences, because I think that's part of why people come back, are those moments that are surprising and where people are thinking out loud. And that's what gets people to say, you got to go listen to this interview, and they share the show. Like, that's the show at its best. And so I started thinking about what those moments were in the Longform podcast for me in the interviews that I have done. And there was a surprising theme, which was that I was super awkward in all of them. Super, super awkward. And so I would like, if you guys are game, to listen to some of these moments in which I've been horribly awkward. And they have revealed something. They are, in fact, like literally, these are some of my favorite moments on the show. And I can't tell whether it's my awkwardness that prompted them or not, but I think maybe it is. Anyway, I'd like to listen to them together before I forgot I put that in. So last night at like 3 a.m, I'm like very jet lagged and I'm not sleeping at all. I went down a real rabbit hole with like stock photography of awkward interviews. And there's tons of these. They're amazing. So this is my spirit animal for the awkward interview. Okay, so the theory here that I'm trying to espouse is that awkwardness in an interview is a good thing. That's my thesis. But I feel like I just want to start by disproving my own thesis, which is just to say awkwardness is not always good. There are times in which it is simply bad and simply awkward. It produces nothing of value except horrible feelings in yourself. So for this first example, Jessica Pressler is an incredible journalist at New York Magazine. And right before I did the interview, I called up a friend of hers that I know. And I was like, I should say, not a very close friend of hers, sort of like an acquaintance. And I was like, hey, is there anything about Jessica that you'd be interested in knowing? And she was like, oh, you know what's always been kind of weird to me? Like, how is she married to a journalist? How does that work? So we'd had this great interview. It had gone really well. And then I asked this.
I have some more questions for you, and then we'll let you go.
Okay.
You were married to a journalist.
I was married to a journalist.
I did not get enough research done.
So just for you scoring at home, that was married to a journalist, recently divorced. And again, I just want to make clear, like, it doesn't always go well. So this is what happened next.
Really? I was, yeah.
Oh
no, it's
sorry.
okay. No, it's okay. I was married to Ben Wallace, who now works in New York Magazine. It's all good. We're friends. Yeah. But, journalists shouldn't necessarily be married to each other.
Well, I got to tell you, that's an interesting way for that to go, because what I was going to ask you was, how is it like to be married to a journalist? Was both being in the same profession part of what went wrong?
Probably a little bit. I mean, like, you have the same exact neuroses, basically, and
well, also, like,
let's get into the therapy portion.
Well, this is so would you advise other people to get in relationships with journalists?
No, I advise them against it, actually.
Would you advise people who do interviews with journalists to do better research before they ask them about their personal lives?
It's not like it's online. I mean, the New York Times doesn't do divorce announcements. That kills the rest of your questions.
Sorry about that.
That's cool.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't kill my line of questions. It just makes me feel shame.
Well, you're good at that, so it's fine.
Thank you.
Doesn't always go well. But sometimes it does. A little while after that, I don't know, in podcast time, how long it was, we landed an interview with Ira Glass, who created This American Life. It was like a big get for us. It was exciting. I was very, very nervous. And I did the interview at Ira's office in like the This American Life recording studio. And I showed up. I'm just going to tell you a little story, and then I'll play the clip. I showed up, and he was in a meeting with a couple people, one of whom was a friend of mine. And I was standing outside as a glass door, and it didn't seem like a good meeting. It seemed like a bad meeting. And he walked out, and he said, "Let's go." Not as warm and courteous as I know you to be on the radio. And then I looked inside, and my friend went like this. And so then we go in to the studio, and it's like a real away game. Like, he was sitting in his own seat and like working the board and everything. And we talked for an hour, and it felt pretty clear to me that he was in a bad mood. And it was also pretty clear to me that, like, I really wanted Ira Glass to like me. That was like important to me. And so we did this whole interview, and Ira Glass did not like me. Pretty definitively. And but we did this whole thing, and the whole time I was feeling terrible because it just seemed like he was having a bad time. Like, I'd kind of imposed on him, and I walked out, and I just felt awful. And I called our editor, who was also excited about it, and I was standing on the street outside This American Life, and I'd sent her the audio already, and I called her and I said, it was terrible. It was just terrible. It's awful. And she was like, "Oh, it can't be that bad. It's not that bad." I'm like, "No, I really blew it. Like, I botched it." And I got on the subway, and this was still when there wasn't cell reception on the subway in New York. And so I was about halfway through my ride, and I thought, man, like, I can't believe I just blew that. I can't leave it like that. I can't stomach the idea that we got this Ira Glass interview and it's not going to deliver. I didn't do any of the things I was talking about before. I didn't feel like I was listening or present or any of those things. And so I sent him an email from the train asking to come back and talk to him some more. Didn't have to be right then, but if I could come back at some point and ask him some more questions. And the email didn't send because you didn't have cell reception. And so I get off the subway, and there's all these texts from my editor pop up email sends, right, like automatically, and all these texts from my editor pop up, and she's like, "This is great. What are you talking about?" And it was. I listened to it, and what I realized was that he'd been great. He had been totally focused on the tape, all the stuff that Aaron's talking about, like focused on the listener. And, I sounded a little weird, but who cares? Like, he was saying all kinds of smart things about radio. So it was going to be totally fine. It was a satisfying interview for sure. But I'd already sent this email saying, I feel like I totally fucked it up. Can I come back? And he said yes. And I went back, and then this happened.
Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Does this work?
Yeah.
How do we sound? We're okay?
We sound okay.
All right.
My voice is a little lower than it was last time.
That's okay. I think people are going to know that I'm coming back.
They are? Oh, you're going to say I went back.
Mm-hmm.
Oh.
Yeah. I'm embarrassed now about coming back because I listened to the edit this morning. She did the edit.
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny because at the end of the thing, we're talking about like editing and the power of editing and how everything good is edited. And it's good. Like, it's good.
What was the thing that you felt like you didn't get that you're coming back to get? Like, what was the missing thing?
I have some questions for you, and I'm gonna ask you them. But I think the missing thing was that, like, I wrote you in that email when I asked to come do this. Like, I think I was just a little off. I felt a little off, and I was bummed about it.
Well, off like I said things that you didn't follow up on in the way that like often haunts me after an interview of like, oh, they said this, and why didn't I say this?
Yeah, a little of that. Like, just not not listening great. Not super. I don't know, present. Just not a conversation. Like I think I was just kind of like waiting for you to talk more, and then and then I was just like, oh shit, it's my turn to talk. I kind of forgot I was here. You know what I mean?
That's weird.
It is weird.
I cast a magical spell.
You do. You're an enchanting man. But yeah, I'm a little embarrassed because like what we have is fine. It's good. It's not just fine. It's good. And the only person in the world who is going to know or feel badly about how I did is me.
I think that's awesome. I think that I love that it just bothered you and then you came back. I respect that, and I would do the same.
I did listen back to it, and I have some follow-up questions.
Okay.
You talked in the thing both about your personal life and your professional life. Like when you were starting the show, when you were younger, if you asked people you worked with or your friends, they'd be like, he was a shitty boss and a shitty friend.
Wait, I said that, or
you said that?
I said that. Yeah,
you said like
I
you were tough to work with, and you weren't a great friend to people at that time.
Yes.
Was that a requirement to do something at the best possible level?
No, absolutely not. No, of course not.
Really?
Yeah, no, I just didn't know what I was doing, and I was in over my head, and we were a tiny staff. There were too few of us doing the job. Like
I think my romantic view of it is like, if you're dedicated to greatness, like you just sacrifice everything for the work.
No, that's how dicks justify bad behavior. No. Like, and just I want to be clear. Like, I wasn't an awful boss.
I understand,
but I wasn't a good boss, and I think I wasn't kind.
So that's a time where it did work. Like, we talked for another 20 minutes or so, and those 20 minutes were so much better than what had come before, because it wasn't just kind of like Ira radio wisdom. He said all this shit that he had not said before or said since, including like that line, which has really stuck with me, that that's what dicks tell themselves. But also, it was like right after Serial had come out, and he talked really openly about how it was kind of weird and uncomfortable for him that he was not the star of the show. It was really revealing, so revealing, in fact, that he went on like a long tweet thing afterwards about how he was never going to listen to it because he had said too much. And that was all because of some willingness to be uncomfortable and look like a schmuck, but also just kind of sit in that discomfort and bring it into the room, and it opened him up. Here's another version of that. It's slightly different. It's an interview with David Remnick, and it's the very end of the interview, and you'll hear, but what we were talking about was basically like, what's your life like after you're the editor of the New Yorker. And I don't think that's a thing that he gets asked about very much. I don't think it's a thing he talks about very much. I think it's never a thing that he talks about at work. And it was a hard thing to ask him about. And what happened, which you'll hear, is that he kind of answered the question for himself.
Whenever it is that
You seem really nervous to ask this. You shouldn't.
no, I'm just trying to put it in the right way. I mean, I'm trying to be as thoughtful as you have been. I'm trying to figure out what I really want to ask.
Max, ask what you want to ask.
I'm honestly trying to figure it out.
I think what you're trying to ask is, do I need to have some other thing where I'm the boss or have some sense of power? No.
Do you think about life outside the chair?
I'd be lying to you if I didn't. And it's a mixed bag too, because here's the thing. I haven't said this. I love this activity. I love this activity. When something is handed in that's good or great or thrilling, it's just, I'm so grateful. And and ironically, the stuff that makes the magazine the best is the things that have the least to do with the editor, which is to say, the grateful reception of brilliant work. The key thing is creating the environment so that that happens.
Thanks, David.
Thank you, Max.
And the aftermath of that one was not dissimilar. I got like tons of notes from people at the New Yorker who've been working with him for 15, 20 years, who told me that they'd never heard him talk that way before. Again, it, like I am right now, it took me like stammering and being pretty awkward, but that created some space. And it created some space that he went and filled with a thing that I think he has been thinking about or had been thinking about and hadn't been talking about at all. And it was powerful. The next example is really similar, although in a different way, which is a couple years ago. I don't know exactly when. I read this article also in the New Yorker. It was called "Thanksgiving in Mongolia," and it was written by Ariel Levy, and it was about her giving birth in a hotel room in Mongolia at 5 months and losing the baby. It's one of the greatest magazine articles, one of the greatest pieces of writing I've ever read. It's there are basically no words to describe it, as you'll hear. And I read this article, and I was just so moved and affected by it. I had just had a kid myself. I was kind of like in a fugue state, and I wrote her an email and asked her to come on the podcast. And then she wrote back and said yes. And then as soon as that happened, I was kind of like, oh God, I actually have to talk to her about this. How am I going to possibly do that? And so she came in and we talked about her career and other articles she's done. And I was just kind of like waiting and putting off talking to her about this because, you know, it's an unfathomable human experience. And I didn't know quite what I wanted to ask. And so she helped me and delivered what I think is like one of the great monologues about writing that I've ever heard.
Have other people struggled to talk to you about it? Is it I guess, how did it change once that story was out there? I'm trying to figure out.
Do you want me to just like help you a little bit?
Yeah, just help me along.
Okay, I'll help you.
Okay.
So before we came up with that story, my editor, Nick Troutwine, said, you know, I definitely want to publish this. We got to publish this.
Did you write it for yourself?
Yes. Well, I write everything for myself. You know, like, I don't mean to sound like a jerk, but I do. I mean,
the thing I'm trying to ask you about,
okay.
I guess, is why put it in a magazine?
Why not? I'm a feminist. And I think that having a baby come out of your vagina on your bathroom floor in Mongolia is real. That's real. That happened to me. I'm not making that up. That happened. And if you're not going to write about that, what the hell are you doing? Are you a writer? And I think the idea that blood and birth and tragedy of a distinctly female nature, that's real. That's as real as, I'm going to go hunting swordfish, whatever. Right. You know what I mean? This is real. That's what women do, is they push human beings out of themselves. That's intense shit. And it goes wrong a lot. It's gone wrong for a lot of my friends, and it's gone wrong for me. And I don't understand why you wouldn't write about that if you were a writer and you were a feminist and that was your reality. I don't understand why you wouldn't.
I sort of like never forgot that moment. It stuck with me. It was one of the first times for me on the show, at least, where I felt just as kind of open and vulnerable, or somehow more than her, and could sort of feel myself thinking out loud. And we talked for a while longer about that decision and how she thinks about writing and the role that writing plays in her life. And what I realized doing it was me thinking out loud too, right? So it wasn't just about getting that from somebody else, but where these things really can be incredible is when you're doing that together. And I do think it can be like therapy, like Aaron was talking about. I do think it can be revealing, and both of you can sort of learn something, realize something that you hadn't before. I got one more clip for you, and then I'll get out of here. So this one is an interview with George Saunders, and the conditions for this one. So sometimes you bring the awkwardness, but then sometimes the awkwardness finds you, and you just have to overcome the awkwardness. So we're going to end on a triumphant moment of awkwardness, which was we did this interview in a office in the back of a small bookstore in New York. He was doing a press tour for his book, and the only way we could get him was like for an hour at the bookstore, where he was then going to give a talk. And it was a little cramped space. Evan was there with me, and the talk was with Ben Stiller, and it was like free, but there was already, when I got there, like already a line around the block, and people were trying to figure out whether or not they'd be able to get in. So we start recording, and the phone in this office keeps ringing. And like, I try to interview him, the phone is ringing. I try to unplug the phone, it doesn't work. People keep walking into the office, and they're like, "What the hell are you doing in here? This is an office." It's just like super chaotic. And George Saunders is, he's a spiritual person. He's the kind of person you want to have a kind of meaning of life conversation with. And it was hard. It was hard. It was hard to get there. And it felt a little bit like Ira did, where it was like, this is my shot. I can't let this go without asking these questions. And we talked about writing for a while, and people coming in and, interrupting us and stuff. And then at some point, it just seemed so ridiculous what we were doing that I basically just asked him like the meaning of life.
In that speech, you used this thing that you've used in the past. I feel like you should just pick up the phone and say hello.
But wait, no, you know what you could do is if you just unplug the phone, this particular phone, that would work.
So this is your technical writing thing.
Yeah, I think you just unplug that phone, and that one won't ring anymore. Although that one might. But
I think I just turned that one off in a different way before. Now I'm breaking lights. We clearly should get out of here soon.
Yeah.
Some of this whole
we're talking about kindness and destroying a perfectly nice independent bookstore.
In that speech, and in
Buddha Boy is this construction that sort of forces the listener, the reader, whoever, to think about like being on their deathbed.
Yeah.
And what are you going to really care about? What's really important? And what are your regrets? And I want to ask you what those are for you.
Well, I don't know. That's the thing. I mean, I've had intimations of it, and well, I can tell you, it's that little gap between, when you're saying goodbye to somebody at the airport that you love, and you get all soft. You're like, oh my God, I hardly knew you. That kind of feeling. What if that's the truth? That mode is the mode, that times 10, maybe is the mode that we should exist in all the time. Then another day you're just yourself. There's a big gap between those two people. So my regret would be, how much time did I spend in that regular old stupid habitual mindset of taking everything for granted, as opposed to this exalted state of being super tenderized to the people you care about. And I'm guessing that if there's a heaven, it's that at the airport times 10 or 20 or 1,000. So I think the regret would be that you, like a lunkhead, you spent so much time in that normal state. Well, I wonder what I'm going to do today. I hope my book is selling. How do I look? Oh, I'm going bald. But instead of that mode is habitual, but we know from the occasional foray into it that the other mode is possible. What my advice would be to anyone who wanted it was reconfigure your understanding of quote unquote religion and make it exactly equal to that which will give you that airport state of mind more often.
That idea of like airport moments has been with me ever since. I think about it all the time. Every time I'm like feeling small or like too tired to engage with someone, or just generally sort of like feeling bad for myself, that idea of like, you can feel that other way, and how do you get there more often? I come back to it all the time. It's like incredible life advice, but it's also incredible interviewing advice. Be open to the people you're with, find connection, be okay being uncomfortable. It's the sort of exact thing that we're trying to do in these interviews all the time. And one thing you'll notice from all those clips was I didn't take photos with those people. It's too awkward. So I couldn't bring myself to ask them for a picture afterwards because it had gone so awkwardly. But after the George Saunders interview, he said that we should take a photo. And then we stood next to each other and he said, let's touch heads, because that's what we just did. And that's it.